You're listening to the BBT. I'm John Krol, speaking with Jim Kraft, who is the instructor for the course 20th Century American Poetry, and it's the OLLI course. And actually, Jim, you've been teaching OLLI courses for just about a decade now.
Yes, certainly a decade, probably longer.
So time flies when you're having fun, right?
Yes. Well, I do it the fall and the spring each year.
So tell me about 20th Century American Poetry. What can people expect from this course? What are you looking to...
Well, what I'm really looking to is introduce them to the whole spectrum of American poetry in the 20th century, not just to sort of the necessarily prominent figures. So what I decided to do, which is an unusual way of doing it, for me at any rate, is that I'm going to do 2 or 3 poems of about 30 plus poets over the course of the 5 weeks, and really try to introduce people to the whole spectrum and variety of American poetry, and then also, of course, just to become more familiar with poetry and how it works. I think we all have trouble with poetry, understandably, because it's a way of putting the unspeakable into words, and so it's difficult sometimes for us to feel comfortable with reading it. And I hope by doing this, spreading out in all kinds of different poets, doing all kinds of different kinds of poetry, they'll get a good idea of what it is, and it will be a lot of fun too.
Yeah, and that concept of poetry again, what is its part in our language, and what does it try to accomplish? Is that emotion, that feeling, and that perhaps makes it different than other uses of language. But the 20th century with poetry, how does that fit into the sort of evolution? What is unique about what happened during the 20th century with poetry?
Well, I think the simplest answer to that, but also the most complex, is that poetry was always viewed as something that had a certain number of beats and rhyme. And very little poetry was written before the 20th century that was not in that traditional mode. And then came the whole idea of free verse. Now, certainly it was there before the 20th century, because Walt Whitman did that in the middle of the previous century. But essentially, people who thought of poetry thought of the iambic pentameter, which is 5 beats in a line, and that the lines rhymed in some sort of rhythmic form. The 20th century came, and there was such a blow-up of so many different things, beginning with the First World War, that the notion of what poetry could be to try to encompass this changing world itself changed, to try to include more kinds of views and complexities. So we get almost all free verse poetry. There's a few standouts that are very important, and there's now a sort of movement back to traditional styles. It never disappeared, but that is the big change that came. And maybe the second thing is that the subject of poetry, which was, I'm being very simple about this, but it was about, nature and love and matters of that nature. It began to encompass all kinds of things. War and the way in which you dealt with harsh matters of human reality. And the subject matter broadened as the whole sort of artistic sensibility broadened to include this very much more complicated universe. And I think, if just an analogy for you, in that a painting moved into this very abstract and not immediately decipherable pose, Well, that was the 20th century, so to speak, with the painters, and this is what I've been talking about with the poets.
It's fascinating stuff. We're speaking with Jim Kraft. He is the instructor for 20th century American poetry. We'll continue the conversation after